Reuben Fine disagreed with Fisher's assessment. Morphy's glory, and they're very similar, both Fisher and Morphy, because they did more with less than anybody else, by wide margins. Fisher was the first 2,700, and then he almost gets to 2,800 in a relatively short period of time. Morphy's glorifiers went on to urge that he was the most brilliant chess genius who had ever appeared. Now remember, this was before Steinitz. This was before he wrote anything about opening theory. There was no engine. There were no books, or at least it wasn't what you expect from studying. You had very little to work with. But if we examine his record in games critically, we cannot justify such extravaganza. We are compelled to speak of it as the Morphy myth. He was so far ahead of his rivals, I love this line, that it's really hard to find outstanding examples of his skill. So let's analyze that statement for a second. One of the dumbest lines uttered in human history, very similar to what people say about Wilt. Wilt's rivals were all plumbers and firefighters, and they weren't really, what we think of as modern professional athletes. But that's the point. Whatever made that era weak, nutrition was bad, and medicine, and recovering from injuries, and workout strategies, and understanding of the human body and the game of basketball, and all these things, those things weren't there. So Wilt Chamberlain was exposed to those disadvantages too, and he was that much better than everyone else despite those circumstances, and so therefore he overcame them. Instead, people will misframe it and say he was so much better than everyone else. That's the argument. Think about it for a second. You're saying he's too good, way too good compared to everybody else. Therefore, that's a bad thing. Not that that's a good thing to validate his greatness. That's a bad thing that undermines it. So it's when you become so great that they have to make an excuse, you have to argue against the game itself, the state of the game, and not against the player, because you can't. His numbers are too great. Same thing here. He's too great, so you make this bogus, coping argument that's not even an argument. He's too good compared to his rivals, and that's how you're always measured, right? So those rivals had the same access to information or lack of access to information as he did. So what do you mean, examples of his skill? His skill was that he was that much better than everybody else, by a wider margin, arguably, than whatever, Magnus, or you can debate that. But even if the myth has been destroyed, that's so hilarious to me. I should do a proper debate actually on the subject, and I'll even incorporate the Wilt one, right? Did Wilt come from Mars? Did Paul Morphy come from outer space? He's an alien. Who is he? He was born and lived in the same time as every other player, right? Both in basketball and in chess. Everybody lived in the same period of time. He had the same advantages or disadvantages as everybody else. He didn't have some special thing. He wasn't born in some chess palace or whatever. He's the same as everybody else, and he was just better. So just try to think. Sometimes the best argument against something is the flawed argument for itself. Something I used to describe religion and other stuff in the past. But let's just look at it here. If your argument for why Morphy isn't great includes the statement he was so far ahead of his rivals, maybe that's not the case that you really think you're making. So it's the same thing with Wilt. Wilt only put up these numbers that nobody else put up because he was playing against a bunch of, again, subpar athletes supposedly, but subpar compared to what? They were the best that you had at the time. So the fact that he was that much better is to his credit. There's a bit of a means argument with that one, because that just kind of triggered me. I was laughing my ass off. I love the lore of chess as much as I for me, it's the total experience. It's not just about playing the game or trying to get better. You got to fully immerse yourself in something to really enjoy it.